we are kind of running out of time. So, since one of the stories that we have on our agenda is still developing, we'll move that to next week because I have a feeling we're going to have a lot of fun. We did have some Nintendo talk tonight, but it's still developing, and so we're going to have some fun laughing at Nintendo next week. So, for the next minefield situation, this has been going on for the past 3 weeks. And it is the situation of Dave Chappelle versus Netflix staff. I need to clarify staff because the CEO is kind of on Dave Chappelle's side. And so in this case, let's just kind of explain this. How many shows did he get? 3 or 4 with Netflix? I think it's 3, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm not really sure of the exact amount of shows he's been given, but we do know that the controversy started with, well, the most recently released show.
No. It started before that. And so the reason I put that into effect is because I believe it's 3 shows, and the way that Dave Chappelle did it was that he connected them together. So that at that point, when he got to the closer, it could be kind of a wrap-up for the deal that he had. And it technically started up with the previous one, Sticks and Stones. Because if you haven't watched the Chappelle Show, or watched... Well, actually, Chappelle's Show is kind of a different aspect, because they had to tone him down quite a bit in that aspect. I liked some of the sketches there, but I do know they had to tone him down. If you've ever watched Dave Chappelle in stand-up, like with most comedians, and he's considered to be one of the best, nobody's safe in that regard. He has criticized his own race, he's criticized other races, he's criticized the Catholic Church, he's criticized a number of organizations throughout the years in his stand-up routine. And one of the ones that happened in Sticks and Stones was the trans community, because he'd already had some complaints about the LGBTQ community having issues with him and his insensitive jokes and whatnot. And Dave Chappelle is one of those guys that is a thorough believer in comedy. And at that point, if you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen kind of thing. But also in Dave Chappelle's case, he just tends to just put a spotlight on it by making fun of you, kind of thing. And so he was already doing that with the LGBTQ community from Sticks and Stones. And in his most recent and final issue, or his final special, The Closer, he addressed some of these as well as kind of put a wrap-up on the situation. I'll get into some of the details about that later, because it actually kind of became a personal investment to him, and we got to find that out in The Closer. But because of his perceived malice with the LGBTQ community, activists within Netflix basically tried to get The Closer taken off of Netflix, and in turn hosted actual walkouts to protest the release of The Closer, as well as, I believe, because one of them got suspended because they tried to go into, I think, a corporate meeting to protest it, and the people who did that were suspended. And yeah, it's become a whole smorgasbord of crap that has ultimately, it's still not even resolved yet, except for the fact that Dave Chappelle has, I think, officially said he's not going to be doing any Netflix specials anytime soon. And on top of that, in The Closer, he also specifically states that he will not do any more trans jokes in his routine. And I'll explain a little bit more in detail, because he also kind of backhanded them in the process. And also has said in a response after The Closer in one of his stand-up routines that if he is going to meet with anybody to negotiate anything with the LGBTQ community, it is going to be, quote, on his terms. So that being said, let's get into the initial stuff with this. Or do you guys want me to bring up the other part that makes this a little bit more effed up?
Well, when it comes to, I think we're kind of bearing the lead in terms of what this was specifically focusing on, which is the walkout that was staged at Netflix by Netflix employees, and more specifically, the fact that a large part of the controversy isn't even so much directed at Chappelle himself, but how the CEO of Netflix responded.
Yes,
And I
because he
think
came
that's
out in support of Chappelle.
yes, exactly. And that's really what set things off, where there were the initial condemnations from a lot of the usual groups against Chappelle's material.
Yep.
And then, well, the CEO basically, well,
Came out in
doubled down
support.
saying, hey, yeah, nodded in support, basically said, hey, this special's making us a lot of money. We don't really care otherwise. Granted, he didn't say it in those exact terms, but that was how a lot of people interpreted it. The way from my perspective here, from what we're seeing
which
here,
also we should point out, in retaliation, some of the comedians that are on the side of the LGBTQ community, such as people like Hannah Gadsby, actually came out and publicly condemned the CEO of Netflix for not only supporting Dave Chappelle, but also in some ways having a clear bias towards him, because in their eyes, he made more money than them, and therefore that means he's worse.
Yeah, and another
or at least that the CEO of Netflix had more faith in him and less faith in the others.
Yeah, I mean, probably the biggest aspect of this is that earlier in the year, especially between the various protests as well as a lot of the things that went on with Pride this year, you had Netflix putting out a lot of advertisements about how it's like, hey, we're a super inclusive company. We care about like marginalized groups. We care about amplifying these voices. And naturally, this is the Netflix people being the Netflix staff being like, hey, time to actually show if you actually mean what you're saying, or if you were just saying this for the sake of brownie points.
Well, and especially when a lot of the talk this June of like Pride Month was, I don't know if you noticed this on Twitter, but I noticed it on multiple social media platforms. There was a norm of basically criticizing any major corporation of basically coming out in support of Pride Month and then magically disappearing the second Pride Month went away.
Yeah, and that was pretty much the main crux here. And again, there's a lot
look,
to unpack.
There's reason to have that criticism. I actually do personally have that criticism, and it's not just of the LGBTQ community. They do it with anything. This is why in a lot of cases I don't want everybody and their uncle to have a holiday anymore, because the corporations just take that and go, oh, we're in support of this, and it's just fake.
Well, that and it takes away from the point of events like Pride, where it's not a holiday. Pretty much it's a case of Pride is not like, oh, it's a celebratory holiday. Trying to treat it as something that you can just put on a rainbow and think, oh, yeah, we support gay people. And then, like on the one hand saying you support gay people, but then on the other hand, completely ignoring when the people from that very community that you said you were in support of, that you said you were going to amplify their voices, that you said that you were going to listen to, immediately just saying, I don't care because this other guy makes me more money, your voices don't matter. It very much is a case of, you said all of this stuff, but you clearly don't mean it, and that is where the major crux of this argument of this whole issue comes from, is that Netflix went all out even prior to Pride, being like, hey, we're going to amplify marginalized voices. We're going to like give the microphone to more LGBTQ creators. But then you've got them promoting specials like what comes
corporate line.
Yeah, it's pretty much the usual corporate stuff, and naturally, as is people's right, it's very much a case of, hey, you said these things, time to show whether or not you actually mean it. And that is where a lot of this is coming from.
So at this point, I kind of want to bring it back to Chappelle versus the trans community a little bit, because I do know that people are already going to ask, do we think Chappelle went out of line? I personally do not. But then again, I also, to me, comedy is supposed to be thought-provoking. And Dave Chappelle is one of those guys that does it in that perspective. Especially now that I've heard of some of the things that he said in the closer in regards to a trans friend of his that actually came out in support of him after Sticks and Stones, and long story short, committed suicide because of the dogpiling that happened on them because of that. And he actually addressed that in the closer, and it's part of one of the reasons why he decided to not do the to not mock the trans community anymore. At this point, I'm not gonna fault him. I think in a lot of cases his comedy did what it was intended to do. And so at that point, am I a fan of what he said? I'm not really a fan of Dave Chappelle's stand-up, mainly because it's got way too many N-bombs to be able to truly appreciate. I like his Chappelle Show sketches, but that's about it. But I do think that he had the right to be able to go up and do the stand-up that he did. And so at that point, I get that the LGBTQ community was pissed off at that, but I mean, he equally went hard on the Catholic Church and Milo Yiannopoulos in the closer event as hard as he went with the LGBTQ community. So I don't see a problem specifically with that. What about you guys? Like, where do you stand with Chappelle and how he's handled this?
Well, with where I stand, I'm going to paraphrase two people, because this is something I often see a lot of people say about comedy, like, oh, everyone's a target. But to paraphrase first George Carlin, comedy is a tool that is meant to be used against those in power. It's meant to cut those in power down to size. And add on to that, there was something that Terry Pratchett famously once said, if you're already laughing at those who are already suffering, that's not satire. That's just bullying. And that's kind of where I stand on this, where, oh, everyone's a target. But at the same time, if you're using comedy to target a group that is already marginalized, you're just punching down. That's not really thought-provoking.
See, and I would actually make the argument that I actually do think that the LGBT community has more power than a lot of people give them credit for at this given moment. Because at the same time, yes, is it a marginalized part of the community? Yeah. And I would say that there's reasons for that as well. But at the same time, like, I was one of the people that criticized the LGBTQ community for giving a report card to John Cena over his anti-gay stuff that he was saying in WWE at the time. And I equally thought that was stupid. Because at that point, like, congratulations, you're whining about the fact that he was making a joke in front of people in order to to make his own point in the storyline that he was going for. So it's in a lot of cases where I actually do agree with the Carlin sense. I do think that Dave Chappelle was punching up in that regard, because, you know, given a lot of the LGBT protests that have happened because of this, I would say that they've got more of a degree of power than they're making it out to be. Especially when it came to, okay, as soon as we find out that there's going to be a protest, immediately it's all over Twitter. It's all over Facebook. It's all over Instagram that they're going to do that. So I think that they've got that moniker of power, but I also kind of agree with your sense, where it's like, okay, well, could he have gone as hard? Yes and no.
Now, to that's
the way that he decided to do it.
I mean, to that, Adam, though, you call that power, but I call that more just visibility. Power is the
visibility
ability
is power in this day and age.
Not necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, real power is the ability to actually bring about change. If Netflix had caved and just said, okay, we'll pull the Dave Chappelle specials, then sure, you can make the argument that maybe they have more power than they want to admit they may or may not have. But a lot of people are visible. Social media has made everybody visible. Everybody has a bullhorn now that they can speak to.
If the other side had more power than the LGBT community, why is Cuties still on Netflix?
Well, that actually leads to the key point, is that they're more visible, but they are not in positions of power to affect that change.
But you're also making the argument that the other side is more powerful. And so at that point, my counter argument is, why is Cuties still up there?
Because the ones that want it still up there are the ones in positions of power, and not the marginalized group that could actually affect change.
Not necessarily. Some of those CEOs wanted, or some of those higher ups in the board of directors wanted the CEO to bow to both Cuties and to the closer.
Yeah, but again, that proves the point. The person in the position of power is the one not bowing and not willing to affect the change that is being called for. That's the problem.
Okay, then what change are we looking to do here? That Cuties is okay, but the closer isn't?
That's a separate thing. The point here, and the point that the people who are protesting are making, is that, hey, if you're going to say that you're in favor of amplifying the voices of the LGBTQ community and for creators of color, actually put them in those positions to actually affect that change. That is what they are arguing here. They're basically taking Netflix to task for saying, hey, you made these promises. It's time for you to own up to them.
See, I agree with that may be one thing, but I also agree to disagree. I think it also was because a lot of those people were incensed at what Dave had said and that the CEO had come out in support of him, and in turn, because that's where a lot of things go on social media these days, they wanted to see the CEO thrown out. They wanted to see Dave Chappelle unpersoned. They wanted to make sure that nobody could ever make the closer ever again, kind of thing.
They also wanted Netflix to put people on their board of directors who are trans, but that hasn't happened. Now has it?
Is there a trans person
happened.
who's actively applying at Netflix to be on the board
I
of
don't
directors?
know, but that's the point, right?
It's not Netflix's job to go and look for one.
Yeah, but at the same time, to counter that, like, are they actively applying? But also the question is, are they actually making those positions open for people to apply? Which, more often than not,
at that point, how
don't.
are you going to prove that they're not? We don't know that. We don't know. We aren't going through with a fine-tooth comb to know that they aren't going through that process.
Yeah, but at the same time, though, given like any media company, Netflix is not immune to things like nepotism, where oftentimes people get in these positions of power because they know a guy who knows a guy, and they work their way up that way, which is also one of the major factors.
But you want to know another place that also happens? The very same community that we're talking about. Hollywood uses nepotism. So does LGBT or BLM when they're trying to organize things. Nepotism is just a thing that should go away, but it's used in a lot of industries. I agree with you. Nepotism should go away. I'm so sick of it. I think 80% of the reason that Hollywood is the way that it is because of nepotism.
Yeah, but point being is that, again, to bring it back to the point that Alex was making, visibility is not the same as power. Because, again, although more eyeballs are on an issue, the ones that are actually in the positions of power to affect change aren't affecting the change. And that's the problem.
And, again, I'm going to agree to disagree. Because I do think to some extent visibility is power in this day and age. Because if LGBT people come out and say that they're going to protest it, what's the chain reaction? You're going to get celebrities involved. The media is going to bring it up. And therefore, it's going to be everywhere. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, Dave Chappelle is visibly being oppressed by the LGBT. You're not going to see the media coming to his defense. You're not going to see social media coming to his defense, and Hollywood is going to drop him like a bad habit. So at that point, I respectfully disagree. I think visibility is power because it leads to a chain reaction that leads to power. Does that make sense?
Oh, I can see where you're coming from. And granted, this is a much more complicated issue than what we're used to usually covering on the podcast. But again, it's one of those things where this isn't going to be an issue that that three guys on the internet are going to solve right away.
Nope.
But again,
at least we're having the conversation.
Yeah, but I'm also reminded of a scene from Hotel Rwanda that kind of illustrates kind of the issue where visibility doesn't necessarily lead to permanent, effective change. And this is the scene where they have the journalist visiting in Rwanda, and Don Cheadle's character base says, "Oh, hey, I'm glad that you're here. When people see what's going on here, naturally they'll do something." And the cameraman just says, "Look, people are going to see this on the news. They're going to go, oh, that's horrible," and then they're going to go back to eating dinner. Naturally, we've seen this. Yeah, and we've seen this happen even recently, where it gets a lot of attention, but then things return to the same boring status quo because It's easy to say you want change. It's easy for people to say, hey, I support this movement, or hey, we want to do stuff. But it's another thing to actually put in the work to bring about that change. And by change, I mean actual effective, lasting change that will actually mean something.
Yep.
Problem is, a lot of people like to jump on a lot of these things saying, hey, we're in support, or hey, we're going to condemn these actions. But then after a while, people are on to the next major thing that gets everyone's attention. Nothing has actually changed. You jump from one big source of outrage to another.
I mean, how long is the news cycle now? Like, we make the joke of, like, 24/7. It's now, like, 30 seconds.
Yeah, and that's pretty much part of the issue. And again, that's why visibility is not the same as power here. Because, again, you may get a bunch of attention on something, but until that actual attention leads to those who are actually in the positions of power, in the positions to actually do something about it, that's not quite the same. Because unless the ones who are actually in the positions who can actually make those decisions, who can actually do something, it's like what it says at the end of the Lorax. Unless the ones who are in positions of power actually care enough to do something, then no amount of shouting, no amount of campaigning is going to do a damn thing.
Well, this is the conversation that should be had on Twitter and on Instagram and on Facebook, and it's not being had. I can guarantee you that. Just from talking to friends, it's basically like with most concepts. It's come down into camps. It's come down into tribes, and that's annoying to me too. It's one of the reasons that I become such an advocate of getting off of social media, because the tribalization is just so heavily enforced on all of it. But I'm once again going to point out, did we come up with anything practical in terms of solutions? No. But we had the conversation. And so at that point, I'm at least going to say, hey, we had the conversation. Because that's not happening on Twitter. I can guarantee you that.
And it's also the first of many conversations that people will need to have, which is the other key thing, because it's never done with just one.
The other thing that I'm also going to point out, and this is going to sound really petty, but this was actually one thing that really irritated me when it came to the Dave Chappelle walkout. So during that, two individuals decided to go and protest in support of Dave Chappelle. One of which was Dick Masterson. Dick Masterson is very much a free speech advocate, especially when it comes to comedy. So it kind of made sense for him to be there. But he also brought a partner of his that he does a podcast with named Vito Gesawaldi. And I've been seeing Vito get a lot of traction when it comes to this situation, because he went there in support of Dave Chappelle and in support of comedy. And ultimately, the mob decided to take his sign and destroy it, and then started screaming. After they destroyed the sign, he just had a stick, and then he decided to scream weapon. And so at that point, they took that away from him. And he's been basically using that as, hey, see, I'm pro-free speech. I just want to remind people that 2 weeks beforehand, he was actively protesting to have someone silenced because they showed up on a podcast. That person was Alex Jones. I'm not saying Alex Jones is smart. I'm not saying Alex Jones is right. But Alex Jones has the right to be able to do podcasts just as much as Vito or myself or Romney or anybody. Please stop giving undue attention to this man, because he's willing to condemn one over the other, and that's not the way I want to do things. So I'll at least just say that if you guys do not know that situation, reach out to me at Drac2326 on Twitter, and I'll update you on that. I don't care where you stand on whether you like or dislike Alex Jones. Alex Jones deserves to talk just as much as anybody. That's my issue on this. That being said, I'm sorry?
True, but one thing that also people need to remember, and it's something that a lot of people tend to forget, freedom of speech does not mean freedom from consequences.
And Alex has had plenty of those.
Exactly.
So at that point, and so at that point, let's show Vito that too.